Cairo with all the latest. Karim, you've been following events for us for several hours now. It looks like celebrations are still continuing, aren't they?
Yes, the atmosphere is still joyous here in Cairo's landmark Liberation.
A little problem there with our connection with Karim Gamal-Ad-Din. We'll try to fix that problem just as soon as we can. But before we bring Karim back, let's again look at these live pictures from Liberation Square. As I said, people continuing to celebrate Mohammed+morsi's win over former Premier under Hosni Mubarak, Ahmed Shafik. Just hours ago, we did bring you live coverage here on Press TV of the Supreme Presidential Election Commission making the announcement, and according to that announcement, nearly 52% of the votes were given to Mohammed+morsi, to be exact 51.73% of the vote, and Ahmed Shafik given 48.27% of the vote. There'd been a lot of concern and a lot of worries there in Egypt in this exact location just before the announcement. There was concern among people that Ahmed Shafik could be pronounced the winner, and people again see him as a remnant or as a symbol of the previous regime. He was the last prime minister under dictator Hosni Mubarak. He even in his presidential campaigns and in his debates had said that he still considers Hosni Mubarak as his role model. Comments like that had angered the Egyptian people, who were against his nomination even from the start. However, since the political isolation law was ruled as unconstitutional by the Supreme Constitutional Court, that made him be able to run for the presidency. There was, of course, a lot of questions whether this presidential runoff would be held because of that political isolation law, according to which members of the former regime could have been stopped or prevented from taking part in elections or even having any posts from this stage on. However, the Constitutional Court said that that isolation law, political isolation law, was unconstitutional and that Ahmed Shafik could run. After that, frustration only grew until the very last minutes, where people were very anxiously waiting in Liberation Square to see who could be the winner. And this coming at a time when there's been a lot of allegations against the ruling military council, also known as SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. They've been accused by a lot of political observers now and people on the streets of staging a soft coup to retain their grip on power. Right now that Mohammed+morsi is to become Egypt's next president, there's questions about how much power he's actually going to hold in the future of Egypt, as right now the military council has managed to retain a lot of power, and some observers have gone as far as saying that the new president is only going to be a puppet in the hands of the military council. Of course, all this is going to be clear once Mohammed+morsi does become the president and once he does take office. We have to wait and see what's going to happen. Right now, Egypt does not have a parliament. Just ahead of the presidential runoff vote, we saw the Constitutional Court declare the parliament as illegal and unconstitutional because of fraudulent processes, it said, in the election process. But of course, as I say, we have to wait and see how this is going to look for Egypt as it faces a new president, a very historic moment now, the first, we're hearing, civilian president to be elected in a freely contested poll in Egypt. Well, celebrations erupt in the occupied territories as well as the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed+morsi wins Egypt's presidential election. Let's take a look. These are scenes from the Gaza Strip. Joyous Palestinians pouring into the streets despite years of suffering from an Israeli blockade. A blockade which Tel Aviv imposed on Gaza in collaboration with Egypt's ousted leadership. But now many Palestinians say they're optimistic that the new president in Cairo can change things for the better. Also in the headlines today, protesters in Yemen's city of Taiz are once again out on the streets to reject dialogue with the government. The protesters are against the government because they say it's equally shared between the political opposition and officials from deposed ruler Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime. The new government was formed earlier this year under a power-sharing deal directly backed by Saudi Arabia and the US. The deal also kept some of Saleh's allies in key military posts. That's why these protesters are angry. They say the deal ignores their main demand, which is the downfall of the Saleh regime. Now the demonstrators say they'll keep up their rallies until they achieve the goals of their revolution, which started in February of last year. Justice prevails. Tunisia extradites former Libyan Prime Minister Baghdadi al-Mahmoudi to Tripoli. The move comes months after Libya's new rulers guaranteed that Mahmoudi would not be mistreated by the revolutionaries. Tunisia had arrested the former premier in September after he fled Libya following the overthrow of a slain former leader Muammar Gaddafi. He initially received a 6-month jail term for illegally entering Tunisia. Later, the appeals court overturned his conviction and freed him, but he was promptly rearrested after Libya issued an international warrant for his arrest. Now the so-called stalwart of the Gaddafi regime will stand trial for his alleged crimes against the Libyan people. Ankara calls for an emergency NATO meeting to discuss the latest escalation of tensions with Syria over a downed Turkish warplane.
I have instructed for a notification to be made within the framework of Article 4 at the NATO Council meeting in the upcoming week. In addition, a notification will be made to the UN Security Council in light of the information we have regarding the background to this aggressive attitude.
Turkey's Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu says the fighter jet downed by the Syrian military was flying over international waters and was not engaged in any spying mission. However, Syria has strongly denied that claim. Damascus says its anti-aircraft gunners shot the plane down after it crossed into its airspace. Turkish media says rescue teams have located the wreckage of the aircraft. Turkish Premier Recep Tayyip Erdogan has held talks with the leader of the main opposition party to discuss a possible response to Damascus. Elsewhere in the news now, dozens of arrests in Israel during demonstrations against social and economic injustice. Here's a look at clashes between Israeli police and protesters in Tel Aviv. As you see here, angry protesters have smashed bank windows. They also blocked roads in central Tel Aviv. Police detained 85 people during the rallies that erupted on Saturday night. The protesters want social reforms and affordable housing. They're also angry at reports that an activist had been wounded while being arrested at a demonstration on Friday. Israel has previously seen mass protests demanding lower living costs. Banging on pots and pans, this was the scene in the streets of Paris. Students have marched in a show of solidarity with Canadian students in Quebec. Large numbers of students, as you can see in these pictures, have staged a demonstration in Paris. They marched all the way to the Eiffel Tower in support of their fellow students in Quebec. French students condemned the Canadian police violence and a new law that limits the right to protest in Canada.
This is an action of support, and we agree with the citizen movement in Quebec, calling for access to higher studies. We condemn police violence and we condemn the implementation of Bill 78. So it's solidarity that comes from the heart.
Canadian students are furious about government-announced plans to raise tuition fees by 75% over 5 years, and an emergency law that limits the right to protest has added fuel to the fire. More than 150,000 students in Quebec have been on strike since March. That is more than 1/3 of all students in the province. Oil workers in Norway have started an indefinite strike in what appears to cost millions of dollars for energy companies due to production closures. Some 700 offshore workers are on strike for the initial phases of the strike, shutting down 2 major platforms. The industrial action comes after labour unions and oil companies failed to reach agreement over pensions and wages. The workers are demanding higher wages and better retirement conditions. The stoppage will cut oil and gas output in the North Sea. It's the first of such action by oil workers in Norway since 2004. Norway is the world's 8th largest oil exporter. As World Refugee Week ends, the search for survivors from a refugee boat sinking near Christmas Island between Australia and Indonesia is now turning into a body retrieval operation. It's feared that many refugees drowned when their boat capsized. Meanwhile, hundreds turned up in Sydney to protest for the rights of asylum seekers. Daniel Pizarro reports from Sydney.
The search for survivors from Thursday's boat sinking off Christmas Island has officially moved into body retrieval mode after hopes of finding more survivors dwindled. It's not the first time that overloaded boats packed with refugees sank on their way to Australia. Over 200 asylum seekers were on board the boat when it capsized. So far, more than half of them have been rescued, with about 9 confirmed dead, but scores of others are still missing, feared dead. The cause of the sinking is still unknown.
I understand that the survivors that have been taken to Christmas Island will hopefully be moved to the mainland sooner rather than later, so they can be able to access all of the support services they need. And I obviously totally support the government in being able to do that as quickly as possible.
Meanwhile, hundreds protested outside Sydney's town hall as part of World Refugee Week.
Just to raise the refugee issues, because I'm one of those refugees, and I'm a lucky person. I spent only 2 months at Villawood, but there is some people who spend 4 years there and some more, and a lot of them they are getting some mental issues while they are at the detention there. It's really very bad. There is some security officers who's who's treating people in very rude way.
I don't think the Australian public wants these things to happen. It's just ignorance mostly about what goes on. We trust our government to do what's best by people in need, and the fact that they're not is surprising to most of us, I think, when we find out.
Senator Hanson Young says combating the reasons why people flee their country is a better approach than onshore or offshore processing. The Senator is also introducing a move to curb the powers of Australia's chief intelligence organisation, ASIO, which recently detained 60 refugees indefinitely, including children, on security grounds. But ASIO hasn't announced what threat they pose. The bill will give refugees the right of appeal against security assessments given by ASIO to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The powers are also being challenged in the High Court of Australia.
Those assessments are made about people so that they can challenge them or have them reviewed, because the result is that genuine refugees, including children, will now spend the rest of their lives effectively imprisoned unless they can have the assessment reviewed. And that is like having somebody sentenced without having any of the process of being able to understand what the charges even are.
Last week, the Joint Parliamentary Committee into Intelligence and Security endorsed the current ASIO security assessments as the correct procedure into refugee assessments. ASIO also said that any appeals to the AAT would be a significant drain on resources. Daniel Pizarro, Press TV, Sydney.